On this week's program, we sit down with Trent Horn and have an honest discussion about the sex abuse crisis in the church. We'll also explore early Christian history through a pagan lens with Catholic speaker and author Gary Michuta. All this and more up ahead. Karlo Brousard, author of Prepare the Way, Overcoming Obstacles to God, the Gospel, and the Church. There's this guy named Laplace, and he was a French scientist, and he wrote really the greatest book on celestial mechanics ever back in the 18th century. And he's presenting it to Napoleon, and Napoleon says, and Napoleon's just being a smart aleck here.
Right,
He's he'd like to do that to people. And Napoleon says, but there's no mention of God. I should do it with a French accent, but I can't. There's no mention of that. No, there's no mention of God in here. And
you can do it Cajun. There's no mention of God there.
There you go. Okay, maybe that's how Napoleon talked. But
it's a form of French, right?
So Laplace responds to Napoleon, I had no need of that hypothesis.
Yeah.
And a lot of modern, I don't think Laplace himself meant it this way, actually, but a lot of modern atheists will say, look, I don't have the need of the hypothesis of God,
right?
Because there's all these great scientific explanations, and I can do celestial mechanics, and I don't need to refer to God at all. So why am I bothering with God if science doesn't find him anywhere?
Yeah, that's right. So the idea is that science is sufficient to get the job done.
Yeah, it's getting the job done.
And explaining the universe without the need to appeal to some sort of transcendent creator. Well, I think fundamentally the assumption that this sort of idea is working on is that we only appeal to God to fill in certain gaps that we can't explain scientifically, right?
Okay.
So as science, grows in its methods and its ability to explain things about the universe, well, there's less and less room for God in the picture, right? So it's just, one new discovery of science is one more nail in the divine coffin, right? So how do we respond to this? Well, first of all, we would challenge that assumption because many of the philosophical arguments for God's existence that we appeal to in order to show that God exists do not appeal to God as sort of the best explanation of these physical phenomena that we experience in the universe to sort of plug in the gap, like God alongside naturalistic explanations.
Right.
Well, God's just sort of the best explanation, so it's likely that God exists, or probable that God exists.
That's not how we talk at all about God.
There are some arguments that are very persuasive and can lead one to credible belief that God exists, and utilize these sort of arguments. And that's fine, but there's better arguments, such as Aquinas' 5 ways, right? Some of these arguments I'm going to be articulating in great detail in our upcoming School of Apologetics. The course that I'm going to be teaching is on evidence for God. And I go through a series of these sorts of arguments for God's existence to show, no, it's not probable knowledge, but that we can have demonstrative knowledge, that God must exist in order to account for various features of the material world that science assumes is a reality in order to even begin doing its scientific work. And those features of the material world that science presupposes, such as the existence of things and change itself and motion, these things are the very starting points for reasoning to God's existence.
That's a really kind of extreme thing, because we always think, there's the atheist who says, how would I know? Or you can never prove that God exists and all that. And then there's the atheist that says, absolutely, there is no God. Or 99 point, and those are two different levels.
Yeah, you got atheism versus agnosticism.
Right. It sounds like religious belief. We would say, you could say, well, there's probably a God. I'm pretty sure there's a God.
That's
but you're
knowledge.
Going to the extreme, and you're saying
we can have certainty.
You can be certain
that God exists.
because he must exist, or your science and all the rest of this is not possible.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so fundamentally what I'm saying is that science in principle, number one, cannot give an exhaustive explanation of the material world. It can explain many things about the material world without the need to appeal to God to explain certain things, right? But it can't give an exhaustive explanation of the material world.
Like the question, why is there something instead of nothing? Like
Amen.
Kind of
Number one, because science presupposes certain things about the world.
Yeah.
It presupposes change, and as much as you conduct a scientific experiment, you're going to go from not having knowledge to having knowledge, right? Well, that change is the very starting point for reasoning to God's existence. Science presupposes the very existence of things to observe in the universe, right? So science in principle cannot explain why things exist rather than not exist. So science in principle cannot give an exhaustive explanation of the universe. And much more, moreover, it cannot in principle explain away the need for God, because it's those very features of the universe that are the starting points for reasoning to God's existence, such as change and motion in the universe, such as the very existence of things, as I'm going to articulate in the School of Apologetics in that course.
Which people can find out about at Catholic.com. But I got this question for you, though, because now we have physicists like Stephen Hawking and I'm forgetting the other guy, Lawrence Krauss, who say, look, actually, something just came out of nothing. That's actually how this whole thing works, is that, sorry, Karlo, but we can explain it. It just all right into existence out of nothing.
First of all, they're appealing to the beginning and the origins of the universe, and some of the arguments that we appeal to are looking to the existence of things right here and right now.
Oh, like this can't exist now without God.
That's right.
Not like I have to go back to
the past.
Okay.
Right. But even if we do address those objections pointing to the origin of the universe, they often equivocate on the term nothing. They're using nothing in the sense of like a vacuum state, right? A low-level energy field, where the universe just sort of pops into existence without any known determinate cause. And, I mean, hypothetically, that's possible, but their nothing is not the metaphysical nothingness.
It's not really nothing. There's already a quantum field there.
That's right. There is something there rather than nothing, right? That's a causal nexus or a causal framework for something to be, right? Because, you know, for something to come into existence, it just has to be brought into existence by something actual, right? Something acting in order to bring things into existence. In philosophy, when we say nothing, we mean the absence of being, sheer nothingness. And it's from that nothing comes, because you can't have being coming from non-being, because they're two contradictories.
Only God could do that.
That's right. Well, in that case, it wouldn't be something coming from sheer nothingness, because something would be coming from
God.
God.
All right. Thanks, Karlo.
Thank you, Simon.
Tacitus, I have to say, in writing about the persecutions of Christians under Nero, part of me is like, I don't even believe this. I think that some medieval person wrote this and put it back in Tacitus, because it is such a perfect little history of early Christianity, even including a hint that the Christian belief was destroyed and then suddenly comes back. And you're reading that going, come on, like an ancient Roman historian. It all points so perfectly. So you go ahead and walk us through it, Tacitus and what he wrote.
Yeah,
and I'll see if I believe you at the end.
Okay. I'll try to convince you.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, from memory. Why I think it's authentic is because no Christian would describe it that way.
Right.
Because it's not flattering at all.
No.
He says that Christians are named after their founder, Christos, I think. I forgot what the name is, which he takes as a personal name, which is kind of funny. It's really a title. It's the anointed. Right. And he says that, who lived in Judea, and he suffered the extreme penalty under one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate.
Which is like the creed almost.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like
under
you're reading
Tiberius.
Right, yeah.
And then he says, and the movement was checked for a while, and then it broke out again and spread even to Rome, And you have to, one thing is we have to put ourselves in the shoes of pagans, because to him it is so absurd that a group would grow if their leader dies.
Yes.
They're following a dead leader, right? Why is it expanding?
Yeah.
So, I mean, to him, it's just total absurdity. Yeah, he was put to death in the extreme penalty, and then it grew, And, of course, the part he leaves out is that he isn't dead. He rose from the dead. That's the only explanation for the growth.
Right.
But you're right. It's almost like the creed, but it's through pagan eyes.
Right. And that's what it's the Christian story if you didn't really know the Christian story.
Yeah.
But it exactly tracks with what we know through the Gospels and the Acts of the Apostles and the letters of Paul of that's what happened.
Yeah. And, there's another thing. Most people focus, like historic Jesus research will focus on that little part. But if you continue reading, you find out that he starts talking about Nero and Nero setting fire to Rome.
Right.
And how he tried to pin it on Christians. And originally, Christians were persecuted. Why? Because they were the scapegoats for the fire. But later, they were charged with, I forgot, it was being odious to humanity. I forgot the exact words.
Yeah, I remember what you were talking about, and I've forgotten too. But so right, it's not a charge of
there's a second charge.
The second thing that comes up, not that you burned Rome, but now it's become this is why we're persecuted.
Yeah, and the second charge is really interesting because in Roman law, that charge was made against people who poison others and against magicians.
Right.
And he says that second charge really stuck, that people were willing to persecute Christians because they're magicians.
Yeah.
And in fact, the penalties kind of square with what magicians would be penalized with.
Right.
They'd be set to fire, they'd be fed to beasts, and instead of having their throat slits, they'd be crucified. And so you have to step back and say, okay, what was it about Christians that made these pagans think, hey, they're practicing magic?
Yeah, what were they doing?
And the answer is miracles.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that fits perfectly. So you have hostile witnesses on one side, and then you kind of have the answers on the Christian sources.
Right.
They tell you what's going on.
And then there's the further charge that they're practicing abominations.
Yeah.
And that is I guess a pagan saying, well, we're eating the flesh and drinking the blood of our founder. If that would be the practice of an abomination. That seems like what they're referring to.
Right, and Tacitus kind of alludes that, but he doesn't explain what the abominations were.
Right.
But in another hostile witness, Pliny the Younger, who's kind of an erudite governor.
Yeah.
And we have a series of letters that he has, and he actually investigated Christianity. And so I include that because it's really interesting, because we find out what those abominations are. And basically, he interrogates ex-Christians. He tortures some to get information, and he's fine with that. Right?
Yeah, that's no problem for him, right?
And he describes Christian worship, very early Christian worship, where they meet together on a certain day of the week. They swear an oath to someone as a god.
Yeah.
Okay, and then they partake of ordinary food and drink. And you have to say, why did he qualify it with ordinary, safe food and drink? What did he expect us to be doing?
Right.
And the answer is, the real presence of the Eucharist. They thought we were literally eating flesh and blood as flesh and blood.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So he confirms in a roundabout way the real presence.
Right, and the Sunday worship and the whole, I mean, it doesn't say that it's on the first day of the week or anything.
Right.
But the weekly
there's a
worship.
designated day.
Right. This sounds remarkably like the going to Mass.
Yeah. And in fact, another thing, he also confirms in a backhanded way miracles as well. Because he figured, he's writing to Trajan, the emperor, whether or not, we should be, what should we do as far as, should we torture Christians, kill them, whatever.
Yeah.
And at the end, he says, it's kind of working. This persecution thing's working. Because now people are starting to come back to the markets and buy sacrificial meats and things like that, which is really interesting because there must have been a mass conversion to affect the economy.
Right, enough that you would notice that.
Yeah, so that they couldn't sell sacrificial meats because everyone's not, they're becoming Christian, they're not offering sacrifices.
Indeed, right. And I was also, you have to, I wonder if you're struck by this, but reading Pliny, the quotes that you have in the book Hostile Witnesses, by the way, available from Catholic Answers Press, Hostile Witnesses, How the Historic Enemies of the Church Prove Christianity, from our guest, Gary Michuta. Pliny is a pagan, and he has all the marks of paganism, but it's a very Roman, almost mild kind of paganism. He's like, I don't want to kill these Christians. So I ask them once, are you a Christian? Right. And if they say no, I let them go. And if they say yes, I ask them again. Yeah. And I threaten them a little bit. And if they say no, I let them go. And if they say yes, I ask them a third time. And this time, I really, I lay it on. Yeah, right. You know, we're going to kill you. We're going to torture you. Right. And they still, so it's testimony to the martyrs. Yes. It's not some Christian saying this. It's the actual Roman governor saying, here's how we do it. Yeah. And then if they don't go along, we torture them and we kill them. Trent Horn, apologist extraordinaire. We've got this thing now in the Catholic Church called the sex abuse crisis. Mm-hmm. Did it really happen that these terrible things happened, or is it all some kind of exaggeration?
Well, there have been certainly clearly documented cases of priests and religious who have engaged in sexual abuse and other abuse of minors and adults. And this is something that has been documented to have occurred recently, as well as something to have spanned over the past several decades that have been unearthed recently from several grand jury reports. Along with that, it's been discovered that members of, among the bishops, among other people in the Catholic hierarchy, were involved in transferring priests who were accused of sexual abuse to other parishes or to other locations where their abuse of individuals and minors continued. And it is a grave injustice. It is a tragedy to see that has happened. Thankfully, the church has initiated reform since the scandal first broke in 2002 with reporters from the Boston Globe. That event was later put together into a movie called Spotlight, actually, and detailing how this story broke in Boston in 2002. And the church has made significant reforms since then, so that the number of cases of the sexual abuse of minors, for example, is practically non-existent after 2002. Most cases that are brought forward in media today focus on cases that happened decades earlier, the 1950s, the 1970s.
So it's just so horrible to think that this happened, yes, that these particular acts happened, but also that that was so poorly responded to by the institutions of the church. Mm. So what should we think of that? How should we make sense of the fact that this horrible stuff happened and it got either covered up or just poorly dealt with?
I think what we should put in the forefront of our minds when we deal with the sex abuse scandal is to remember that sin is real, the devil is real, and we are in a conflict, a battle with him for our immortal souls, and he will stop at nothing to get them. And so, so when people think, how could these holy men of God have done such terrible things? It doesn't surprise me. St. John Vianney once said, if you want to destroy a religion, destroy its priests. Because they're the linchpin, especially for the Catholic faith. So it makes sense for me that the devil would attack priests and attack us and try to incite people to all different kinds of sins. That does not, of course, absolve a person's responsibility. You can't say, well, the devil made me do it. Yeah, when someone it chooses to engage in a grave evil, they have to be held morally and legally accountable for their actions. So the two extremes when it comes to dealing with the sex abuse crisis would be this. One, saying there's not a problem, it's completely overblown, and it's not a big deal. It most certainly is a big deal. Okay. Absolutely.
I'm glad to hear you say it, actually.
Yes, and we should be angry. Okay. St. Paul said in Ephesians 5:21, be angry, but don't let the sun set on your anger. Don't give the devil an opportunity. Mm-hmm. So that's okay. But what we can't do is the other extreme is to say, this is my justification for throwing in the towel and leaving the Catholic faith or leaving the church. I'm done with this. You're done with what? Sin, failure, abuse. The problem is that's not a Catholic problem. It's a human problem. You leave the Catholic faith, you join another church, you join a sports league, you go to a public school, you will find this everywhere. So I think that we should acknowledge the horror that has been involved with this and seek forgiveness for when the church has failed in its moral responsibility to be that light, that beacon of hope. But at the same time, I think it's also important, once we have done that, to clarify factual inaccuracies that people have. For example, some people think that this is a distinctly Catholic problem. And it isn't. When you look at data, research involving Protestant churches, public schools. It's the same, if not worse, in some of these other areas.
But if I may, Trent, that's part of how a person who has pedophilia or has the or ephebophilia, which wants to sexually abuse minors. Where they're going to go is where people are caring for minors. So it's going to be schools, it's going to be churches, it's going to be, situations where they can be close to children. So of course you don't have a big abuse problem of minors at IBM or Facebook. There's no minors there.
Right. But even in those companies like Uber and others, you have sexual harassment. You have Uber is reeling from that. So you still have, you're correct, you may not have the abuse of minors because there's no minors, but you still have things like sexual harassment and sexual abuse, which points to a deeper issue that this is a fundamentally human problem, a problem of sin. So if this is a problem of sin, we don't want to throw away the antidote. We don't want to throw away the grace of God given to us in the sacraments.
Right.
Good luck then when we try it on our own. But I do think that from that, it does not follow that we simply be silent. I think as the laity, we have a responsibility to make our voices known, to speak respectfully with bishops, for example, with priests, to ask them pointedly yet courteously, what is being done in my community to make sure this does not happen? What are the safeguards that are being put in place, the checks and balances that are being put in order to make sure everyone is being kept safe? And as I said, even with the Pennsylvania grand jury report, a sliver of hope from that. And it's disgusting, horrible stories to read in there. One sliver of hope is that a very, very tiny minority, I think less than 0.5% of these cases took place after 2002, when reforms were put into place to prevent sexual abuse, to encourage reporting of these incidents. And that in the 1950s and 70s, many people, even secular professionals, did not think pedophilia was necessarily a crime or that it was an incurable condition. Attitudes towards abuse are much more lax in the middle part of the 20th century. So while it was still wrong to cover up or to transfer priests who were involved in this, you get a greater understanding of what was going through people's minds at that time. So I think that, as I said before, we have to acknowledge the horror and sin that's involved, but we should not be hasty to throw away the remedy to the horror of sin itself. But we should seek constant renewal of the church, and that's what the church always has to do. Just as you and I require continual reform in our spiritual lives, especially when we're down in the dumps. Right. The church as the whole is the body of Christ. It always has to do that from time to time as well.
All right, that's so we can. Well, let's put it this way: even if we're very, very, very disappointed, even shocked and heartbroken by the church, the obligations that Christ has put on us to love our neighbor, to grow closer to Him, to all the things that are demanded by the gospel, but also offered by the gospel, are still there. None of that's changed. Nothing's really stopping you from doing it. And you have no excuse for not.
Right. Throughout history, we have seen courageous members of the laity and courageous priests stand up to corruption and sin that has infected the church. The question is, are you going to be one of those people? Or are you, and speaking of myself, this is what gives me some hope and courage and resolve. When I am standing before God on Judgment Day, and He's going to ask, what did you do to serve me, to serve the body of Christ? And I said, well, I stopped going to church because, God, look at what all these guys did. Yeah. And He's going to say, they're not here. What? They're not here right now. You're here in front of me. Right. What did you do? And my answer can be, I hope it will be, I trusted in you, Lord, no matter how hard it got.
What about if you're mad at God about all this?
You can let Him know that. 1 Peter chapter 5, St. Peter tells us, cast all your anxieties on Him, on God, because He cares for you. It's important to say to God, I'm upset, I'm hurt. Some people think that they're so worried about blaspheming God, they feel like they have to treat God like a boss you always have to play niceties with. Right. God knows everything. Now, we shouldn't be disrespectful towards God or enkindle hatred to God in our hearts, but we should treat God like our Father and say, my Father who's in heaven, I'm hurting, I'm scared, I'm upset, I don't like this. Please help. Yeah. And so I think that if we go to God with that honest feeling in our hearts, but always with the mindset of recognizing that He is good and we're just hurting. So I don't think it's good to cultivate hatred of God or anger towards God, but it's okay to honestly go to God and say, I am hurt. I feel angry. I feel scared. I feel sad. and God, I'm looking towards you in all of this.
Thanks, Trent Horn.
Thank you, Cy.
Yeah, well, Jimmy, my question is, so a few years ago, you did a YouTube video about Peter being the first pope, and in that video, you mentioned the Protestant objection of Petros and Petra.
Okay. Not all Protestants.
I'm a little confused on that.
Okay. Not all Protestants make this objection, but it is a common one that you encounter. Some Protestants will argue that when Jesus says, "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church," that Peter is not the rock Jesus is talking about, because there's a difference in the Greek between the word he uses for Peter and the word he uses for rock. The word he uses for Peter is Petros. So in the English alphabet, it would be Petros. The word he uses for rock, though, is Petra. And in the English alphabet, that would be Petra. So the difference is between Petros with the OS and Petra with the A. Now, frequently, when this argument is made, it will be claimed that these two words had a different meaning. And exactly the way that's articulated will vary from one person to another. But the basic claim that you'll have made is that Petros, the one that he uses for Peter, is like a small stone, whereas Petra is like a huge rock, like maybe a cliff face or a boulder or something like that. And so the argument then will be that Jesus is contrasting Peter, a small stone, with the big rock that his church is really built on. So it's kind of like he's dissing Peter. You know, Peter, you're just this little small stone. On this other big rock, I'm going to build my church. There are a number of problems with this, and I don't know that I can get to all of them today, but the first one is that in Aramaic, the word, which is the language they would have been speaking at this point, in Aramaic, it would have in all likelihood been Kepha in both cases, because the meaning of Petra and Petros are so similar, it would have, in all likelihood, have been represented by the same word in Aramaic. However that may be, now that has to be a little speculative because we don't know exactly what they said in Aramaic. But what we can say is that in Greek, the terms Petros and Petra did have a difference of meaning in some early Greek poetry. So this objection isn't based on nothing. There are some dialects of Greek, and in particular in some Greek poetry, you did have this kind of distinction between the two words. But even though it's not based on nothing, it's based on outdated information, because by the first century, the two terms had become effective synonyms, so that they didn't really have a sharp difference in meaning.
Thanks for watching Catholic Answers Live TV. Join us each weekday from 3 to 5 Pacific and 6 to 8 Eastern for our live radio broadcast on EWTN Radio. Or join us on the EWTN app. Find more videos and live streams on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/CatholicCom. Or find us on Facebook simply by searching Catholic Answers. Jesus Christ is the light of the nations, and we'll see you next week on Catholic Answers Live TV.